on the computer. So we now are recording on my computer. It had been set up to record on the cloud. So let me begin again. Welcome, everybody. Thank you for your patience. Welcome to our fourth Words Across the Water, Writing and Culture Across the Black Atlantic evening for the fall of 2021. Little background on this project. This actually grew out of a grant that my colleagues, Dr. Alison McCletchie and Dr. Frank Martin, who is of the who directs the Standback Museum and Planetarium here at South Carolina State University. We put together a grant to celebrate 250 years of African-American poetry last year. Nikki Finney was gracious enough to be our star speaker. We had planned for her to come in person, and we ended up doing it online. And we had such a good time doing it online that we decided we were going to do several more online events. So last spring, we ran 4 Words Across the Water events, headlined by Frank Martin and directed by Frank Martin and Alison McCletchie. And then this semester, we're running 4 more with the generous support of the South Carolina Humanities, which in turn receives its support from the National Endowment for the Humanities. The goal is to support a cross-cultural, cross-racial, and obviously cross-national discussion on poetry and literature, and all the things that poetry and literature discuss, which of course is human culture. So I want to say a few thank yous. I've already mentioned 2 of the people I have to thank. Frank Martin, who is Dr. Frank Martin, professor in the Department of Visual and Performing Arts here at South Carolina State, and the director of the IP Standback Museum and Planetarium. And of course, Dr. Alison McCletchie, who is an assistant professor in the Department of Social Sciences. But then some people behind the scenes who've helped a lot. Dr. Simon Lewis from College of Charleston. Kwame Dawes, who actually helped support us by giving us names and suggestions. John Robert Lee, the Caribbean poet, and Lauren Elaine of the Furious Flower Project at James Madison University. So I'm going to take a second to introduce your moderator for the evening, and then I'll recede to the background. I'm not going to shut my video off because you'll see a photo that doesn't look at all like me. But I want to introduce you to Dr. Kendra R Parker. I first got to meet Dr. Parker because we would go to some of the same sessions at a number of conferences, and we were often presenting on some of the same works. I remember my surprise that somebody else was supporting on Jewel Gomez, a fairly lesser known vampire novel, The Gilda Stories. Dr. Parker is an assistant professor in the African American Literature program in the Department of Literature at Georgia Southern University. She teaches undergraduate and graduate courses on the Armstrong and Statesboro campuses. Her first book, She Bites Back, Black Female Vampires in African American Women's Novels, 1977 to 2011, was released in November 2018 by Lexington Press and was released as a paperback in September 2020. Her second book, The Bloomsbury Handbook to Octavia Butler, praise her name, Octavia Butler, is co-edited collection released in 2020, which centers on African science fiction writer Octavia E. Butler. I asked her about a month ago if she'd be interested in being a part of this program, and she accepted immediately, and not only accepted, but immediately became a full partner in terms of making suggestions, doing a lot of work of publicizing. So I want to thank her for her participation, and I give you Dr. Parker.
Thank you so much. I'm super excited to be here, and I'm grateful for the invitation, and I'm really excited to be in conversation with both of our writers tonight. So for those of you in the audience, we just have a few logistics. Essentially, I'm going to introduce each writer, but they are going to read an excerpt of their work. And after they do that, I'll ask them a question or two, and then I'll ask a general question once they've both read. And then we're just going to end up in conversation. And so if you have questions, we invite you to place your questions in the chat or raise your virtual hand. And, you can turn on your camera, turn on your mic, and ask your question, because I'm really looking forward to the conversation. And so without further ado, up first is Sherry Jones, a self-proclaimed voracious reader as a child. Sherry is a Barbadian writer, lawyer, and mom of 4. Her debut novel, How the One-Armed Sister Sweeps Her House, was published in January of this year and was shortlisted for the 2021 Women's Prize in Fiction. Sherry has prepared to read an excerpt from her debut novel, so let's virtually show our appreciation for Sherry Jones.
Thank you, Kendra. Thanks, everybody. It's wonderful to be here. Thanks for having me. I'm going to read an extract from just about the middle of the novel, and I'll just get right into it. 20th August, 1984. The following afternoon, the first Mrs. Whalen comes for her children. She sweeps onto the rear patio because, in the way of these houses, the only visitors who can enter from the front patio are those who come like salt air right off the surface of the sea. As it happens, Mira is on the rear patio, staring at the service gate, wondering if she should change the locks or add another foot of brickwork to the top of the wall so that the house cannot be seen at all from the road. The red Datsun crawls up the street and slows to a stop. At first, Mira swallows panic because she believes that this car means the return of the robber. But it is a muted panic, something she feels through cotton, because she is smoking a spliff and she was never a spliff smoker before now. And this is the effect that ganja seems to have on her, this muting of painful things just enough so that she can endure them. The panic dissolves into giggles because she is watching a woman alight from a little red car, and ganja wisdom tells her that this is the first Mrs. Whalen, and because it reminds her of childhood cartoons where a huge clown disembarks from a tiny red vehicle for the sake of a few laughs. The first Mrs. Whalen is decidedly not huge, but her dress is large and billowy. She does not wear the paint-smeared jeans and t-shirt of Mira's imagination. The undersides of her nails are not smeared with greasy acrylic paint. Her hands are not coarse from stretching canvas and miscalculating the distance between her finger and the staple gun. The giggles coalesce into a hollowness inside her stomach. The first Mrs. Whalen refuses a cup of tea or a glass of mauby or to come inside. She does not want to share a piece of Rosa's renowned great cake or to be served a square of warm cassava pone or a few slices of avocado brought for more than their worth from the wiliest of the market vendors in town. The first Mrs. Whalen just wants her children and keeps the taxi waiting, its engine continuously clearing its throat in weak riposte to the roar of the waves. It is an old taxi, one of the ones you find if you come out of the arrivals hall, past the shirt-jacketed airport taxi drivers with their gleaming white machines, past the buses and coaches awaiting the tour groups. The Datsun would have been one of the pack of unlicensed taxis circling the perimeter of the airport, with raucous drivers shouting their best fare offers. You would have had to have been aware of the big difference in the fares between these taxis and the licensed ones to know to take one, Mira thinks. And she suddenly understands that the first Mrs. Whalen has visited the island before, that the home she is visiting was once her own, that she must have stood on this very patio in this very house with her husband when her husband was still Peter, and watched the road that Mira, in clean pajamas, freshly washed by Rosa, is staring at now. Mira is suddenly grateful that Rosa scrubbed her skin and shampooed her hair. Mira imagines that the first Mrs. Whalen would have been horrified to turn up and find her disheveled and smelly. This makes Mira laugh harder than ever. Rosa comes, her round face beaming at the sight of the first Mrs. Whalen, her soapy hands embracing her without a second thought by either of them. Rosa does not hug Mira with soapy hands. Rosa did not hug Mira at all before Peter died. The children come shrieking and join Rosa in embracing their mother, and Mira feels the old knife in her gut, only just dulled by what she is smoking. Thank you.
Ooh, virtual claps. So I think that there's so much to unpack in just like this page or two that you've read. And I'm especially thinking about the theme tonight, food and family. And so I'm wondering if you could just say a few words about why you chose this particular excerpt, because I'm thinking about the first Mrs. Whalen's refusal to accept this food, and then also the second Mrs. Whalen's sort of rumination on the absence of certain things that are happening, like Rosa doesn't hug her, the absence of children. And so I guess, how or why did you choose to juxtapose food and family in this way, in this particular scene?
Yeah, so knowing what the theme of our discussion tonight, for me, food is one of those elements of our culture that's so fundamental to how we interact as humans, and certainly as Bajans. And one of the ways in which we show affection or welcome or greet each other is through sharing food. And in this extract, the second Mrs. Whalen is kind of making it clear that there's no love lost between her and her dead husband's first wife. And one of the ways she demonstrates that is through this refusal to participate in that kind of, convivial greeting. There's no acceptance of the offer of great cake or cassava pone or avocado. And that in itself says a lot. This is not sort of a friendly greeting. This is not an open kind of meeting of minds. And to me, that's what made this extract, a good one to read to start us off.
No, absolutely. So powerful. And I think even Rosa doesn't hug the second Mrs. Whalen, but she absolutely hugs the first Mrs. Whalen. And there's this sort of rift that goes beyond food, but the food in that scene is just very, very powerful and important. So thank you so much for that.
Thank you.
Yeah, so let's prepare to hear from Dalma. Uh, so Dalma Llanos Figueroa was born in Puerto Rico and raised in New York City. And through her grandparents, I learned Dalma was introduced to rural Puerto Rican culture, and she was especially influenced by the storytelling that came naturally to some of the older women in her family. And what's really important is that that storytelling appears in Daughters of a Stone, which is Dalma's first novel that is an award-winning novel. And even though she's going to be reading from Daughters of the Stone in just a moment, she does have a new novel titled Woman of Endurance that will be releasing in March 2022. And maybe, just maybe, we'll get a little taste of that work later on in this evening's program. No pressure. But for now, let's show our virtual appreciation for Dalma Llanos Figueroa.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me well?
Yeah.
Okay, great. So I will start right off. The Daughters of the Stone is comprised of 5 books within the novel, and this is from the end of the second book. And it is a celebration of the marriage of 2 enslaved characters and how they chose to create that celebration. And I better put my reading glasses on. Okay. Mati thought of Padre Bartolomeo and his complicity in the stealing of her land. She remembered his white face sweating as he tried to convince her that she had no right to what had been taken from her. She thought about the church in the town where her people were never welcomed, and she turned her eyes away from these when she thought of her upcoming wedding. Likewise, Cheo could not see asking this man who owned slaves himself to bless their union. He remembered delivering heavy pieces of furniture to the rectory and having the priest haggle over a price that had long been agreed on. He remembered the blow he received when the warehouse manager found the discrepancy between the amount on the priest's bill and the amount of money paid. It had been easier to strike a slave than to question the padre's honesty. It had the difference was taken out of Cheo's wages. He ended up working for almost a year without pay. No, this Padre Bartolomeo would have no place in their marriage ceremony. So they found the oldest couple among their people and invited everyone else to meet them at the river on the evening of the full moon. There, the elders chanted ceremoniously in a tongue that no one knew anymore. Their song rose up to the sky and out over the water and across the fields. Then the eldest woman placed her hands on Matthew's head, and the man placed his hands on Cheo's head, and they sang a whispered melody into the younger couple's ears. After this, they raised their voices once again to the crowd. No one understood their words, but their melody seemed more of a benediction than anything any of them had ever heard. Even though a large crowd was present, the ceremony was intimate and very brief, but the celebration went on all night and into the morning. So the batey was full of the smell of lechon asado on the spit since early morning, and batatas roasting slowly on the fire stones. The cook boiled huge pots of pinto beans until they were tender and juicy, with big chunks of pig's feet floating in the sauce, heavy with fatback, garlic, and cilantro. And the morcillas sizzled in the big frying pans. The children sipped sweet lemonade and munched on crispy chicharrones and sugarcane sticks. The men brought out a barrel of cañita with the fermented fruit lying deceptively harmless in the bottom. After the elders' blessings, the drummers brought out their instruments, the tumbadora, congas, tumbao, timbales. They played the secrets of Africa in their complex musical lines, each of the drums providing a different voice until in unison, they became a chorus that drove the rest of the instruments. Their music was a pulsing, breathing creature that lived on air and wood and stretched tides. The next came the maracas and guiros made from their own iguero trees and a handful of seeds, adding the swish of the ocean as an underpinning of female softness to the male drumbeat. Other men brought out a tres, a cuatro, and a guitar, the strings of which added lyricism to the festivities. One young man brought out a clave, a counterbeat in the music. Brown bodies glistened in the heady scent of pleasure, sweat, rather than work sweat. The bodies moved, swayed. Women's hips pushed the night air, side to side, buttocks firm, pendulum-like, and dangerous. Men's thighs twitched, enticed by the undulations under the wide skirts, insinuating themselves between the modest or openly wielding columns of female flesh hidden there. The older dancers, stately men holding their heads up and their gray-haired women, danced the controlled dance of long ago courtships, holding their shoulders straight, their knees bent, ignoring the stiffness of a life's worth of working in the fields. The men wore their guayaberas open at the neck. The women twirled in wide, colorful skirts, amapolas stuck seductively behind their ears. Children practiced adult moves, giggling, playing at little men and little women. All added the sounds of their bare feet on the newly constructed platform to the sounds of the musicians. The music lines wove in and out. The coquis stopped their own music to listen to the sounds floating up from below, and they were jealous of the sound of human celebration. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I have to say, I'm torn between wanting to dance and eat right now.
Then I did my job well.
Yes, you did. 'Cause I'm just like, am I hungry or do I want to dance? And so what's interesting about your passage is that, of course, it's a really good compliment to Sherry's, because of how different it is, right? So in Sherry was talking about, there's this sort of rupture, right? Food is supposed to be something that brings people together, but there's this rupture, this refusal to participate in these sort of niceties. But here you have a marriage scene, and you literally, for me, marry food and dance together. That's why I'm just like, I don't know which one I want to do, eat or dance. And do you just want to say anything about this particular scene? Because you opened giving us a little bit of backstory that it's two enslaved people getting married. And so would you like to share a bit more about that?
Well, there are two things I'd like to say about that. One has to do with a lot of the images of enslaved people in historical fiction are all about deprivation and pain and the beating down of the spirit. And I wanted to show this other part of our history, which is that regardless of what was happening around and to us, there was still the humanity of the positive, of the nourishment. And I see this scene more as a nourishment on one, the physical level of food, and two, the emotional and spiritual level of the healing music. And the fact that so many of the colonized areas, the first thing the colonizers did was ban the drum, which is the heartbeat of the people. And so that was really important to me, to show that despite everything, there were moments of joy and celebration and community that sustained us throughout those years of brutality, frankly.
No, absolutely. Look, I know y'all are getting ready to take us to school, church tonight. So I'm here for all of it. But no, I love that. And it's true, it is sometimes very difficult to think about enslavement. We often do think about the brutality and we don't get enough of the joy. And so that's one of the things I appreciated about your text, is that even in the midst of the brutality that happens, we do get glimpses of joy. So I want to thank you both for sharing your work with us, some of your preliminary thoughts. And I do want to kick us off with a particular conversation, and I want us to think about journeys. So in a 1978 interview, Toni Morrison explained that her writing had to appear effortless to the reader, noting that the seams can't show. And she was speaking specifically about what makes it in the final version of a novel, and she describes her writing process as a journey, but her journey is like very nonlinear. And so because you both take your readers on several journeys with your characters, I want to flip the script. And so what journeys did your characters take you on as you wrote your novels? And what of their journeys did you have to leave out of the final book? So either one of you can jump in and start.
Sherry, I think you should start.
Oh, wow. Oh my gosh. Wow, that is a really, really good question, Kendra. I think one of the journeys that my characters took me on was really a journey back to the Barbados of my childhood. And I actually looked at that as a real opportunity, a gift of sorts. The 1980s, I would say, would have to be the decade in which I came to kind of know myself, as I, really started to, I think, probably differentiate from the me that perhaps was still attached to my parents and their expectations and so on, and just started to venture out into trying to understand the world and my place in it for myself. And there's so many things about the 80s that I remember with fondness and a sense of nostalgia. So one of those things would have been the women braiding hair on the beach. You don't see that now. That was something that was very, very, very much a part of beach life and local life in the 80s. Hunza dresses, string bags, Walkmans, the Globe Cinema. There were so many things. So there was this journey, I think there was this journey back to, the Barbados of my childhood, of that decade. And I think there was a real opportunity then to kind of engage in that retrospective, kind of look at what I understood about this place, where I was born at that time, and how that understanding of place and people had changed and grown over the years. So I think that was one of the journeys for me that I would say that my characters took me on, and I appreciated it.
Okay, very nice. I'm down. I like that. Walkman's braiding on the beach.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, for me, there were really two journeys. One was the journey of remembrance and paying homage to the oral tradition, and the storytelling that I heard on my grandmother's porch. Of course, at that time, I was a child and was not expected to enter into the conversations of the adults. But it gave me great training as a storyteller and a novelist, because it just wasn't about what happened, but why happened and how did people feel about what happened? And those stories were full of color and light and also, pain and disappointment. But there was always this sense of continuity, because the next night was another night of storytelling. So there was always more to be told and more to be heard, and eventually more to be written about. But so there was that kind of personal journey. I went from being a child in the South Bronx to being sent to Puerto Rico to live with my grandparents. And that was a totally different world. And so that physical journey and the storytelling journey were really important. And then the second part was, as a writer, thinking that I was going to write memoir and writing down all those stories that I heard about. And when I started writing those stories, every single person said, well, that's very nice, but that's not really the way it happened. It happened this way. And for every story that I heard, there were 3 or 4 different versions that were offered to me in total seriousness. And then there were people who were not happy with what I included. And then there were people who were not happy with being excluded. So all of that turned into, I'm going to write fiction, forget about memoir.
Okay.
And fiction gave me a tremendous amount of freedom to take what is known and extrapolate and go beyond and allow my characters to grow as they needed to, as opposed to try and, which you can never do, satisfy the stories of other people. So basically I claimed the stories for myself, and then I could write whatever I wanted to write.
Okay. Wow. Yeah. And so I didn't know that about you, that you wanted to be a memoirist. And so, fun fact for everybody, there was an article published in 2012, and Christina Herrera actually positions Dalma's novel in the context of Afro-Puerto Rican life writers, like memoirists, saying that that's one of the best ways to understand that novel is through looking at the comparison with life writers. So that is fascinating. I didn't know that. Good to know. But I love what you are both talking about, like you were going back where you have personal journeys, spiritual journeys, thinking about that. And so you talked about that in terms of what the characters did for you. And so taking all of this information, I know that there was stuff that you cut out of your novels. And so, what did you have to take out of the final version? Whose stories got left out?
Yeah, for me, there was one character that I remember well, because in writing the novel, I think I really thought she was a cool person. I really liked her, very spunky, very outspoken, irreverent type character. And she was very much a part of the world of the novel when I was working through those initial drafts. But she actually didn't make it into the published book. And that was because I think by the time I got to that part of my writing process, it was a very sort of clinical assessment of what served the story and what didn't serve the story. And although I loved her as a character, what I understood the story to be by that time meant that she couldn't be in it. So, I ended up killing that character. I think I've mentioned before, she lives in my computer. I'm sort of hoping that she will turn up in something else, but she was one of the things that got left behind. So that character, an American tourist on the beach, a very, very sort of evolved woman, middle-aged woman, didn't make it into the final book.
Okay. Well, you did say before in an interview that your novel actually started as a short story. So maybe The American Tourist gets a novella.
I don't know. That's kind of, it depends on what comes to me, because I go through this process. I really do feel as if it's an almost spiritual process. Like I'm given a story, I'm given access to a story, and then I'm asked to put whatever skill or ability I might have in service to it. So it's not something where, generally speaking, my process is not one of thinking, okay, this character is great. Let me see if I can come up with a story that suits her. That's for me, based on my process, it doesn't really work that way. So it would have to be more of an organic process of, me feeling as if I've received the story and somehow her being a part of it.
Okay.
But we'll see.
We'll see. Hey.
Yeah.
Okay. Donna, anything?
Well, my original manuscript for Daughters of the Stone was 528 pages.
Oh.
And my publisher said, okay, you got 300. So you're going to have to make some serious cuts. And that was really traumatic for me because like Sherry, these characters were not theoretical concepts. I really thought and think of myself as a kind of antenna that a receptor of stories that come to me either in sleep or through meditation or some other ways. But anyway, so how to get rid of people who are essential.
Yeah.
And my editor said, okay, the title of your novel is Daughters of the Stone. So follow the stone. Anybody who's not immediately tied to the stone must go.
Okay.
Which meant that most of my male characters had to be reduced, if not eliminated altogether. And that was not easy. I managed it, but I throw nothing away. And those characters are still with me, awaiting me to write each one of them their own story. And so I think at some point there'll be a short story collection that will revive Cheo, for instance, who disappears from the novel at some point. Or, what happened to Maddie, who is in the storm and dies in a hurricane. But we don't know from this book exactly what happened to her. So I think they each are important enough to me to deserve some kind of resolution. So
very nice. And so what I kind of hear y'all saying too is that there's a certain level of authenticity, right? When you come in and create your characters and you think about them, and that's why they resonate with you so much. And so can you talk about the importance of just authenticity as a writer, capturing in your writing, in your characters?
Well, for me, one of the most important issues is the issue of language, and to what degree include the language of the characters. Now, for me, I write historical fiction about 19th century Puerto Rican society. So their language is Spanish, but I am writing a novel in English. And I am assuming that most of the people who read at least this version of the novel will be English-speaking folk, and not all of them will necessarily be bilingual. So to what degree do you honor your characters and their culture and authenticity? And it meant that for me, I made the decision that I was not going to translate. I was not going to provide a glossary, which meant that I had to work much harder as as a writer to make sure that there were enough context clues and nonverbal communication so that any reader could pick up the book and read it and understand it. And I know that there are people who need to know every single word at every single moment. But what I'm asking my reader to do is to trust me, to trust that I will take them to a place where perhaps they haven't been, to meet people who perhaps they haven't met, and to create a world that is vivid enough so that they can enter into it and understand it. And so I'm hoping that when they close the book, they have been somewhere where they haven't been before. And so I work very hard to make sure that that is the case. Because for me to translate would be disrespectful of my culture. And so rather than translate, I share.
I have a follow-up question. Can I ask it and then Sherry, have you go?
Yes, go ahead. Of course.
So you're talking about authenticity and using Spanish. And so can you talk about your decision to italicize Spanish words in the text? Because there is a big debate about whether or not you should italicize.
Right. And I respect both sides of that debate. I'm on the side of italicizing the Spanish language because I'm already asking the reader to follow me. And when I say I will take care of that, is that I feel a responsibility to at least let them know that, okay, we're going to code switch here. We're going to change from English to Spanish. And they may just skip the whole Spanish sentence or phrase, trusting that I will explain what that is. Or they can take it in as a new experience and something that they can add to their own personal development. So, so I think it's become it. I've heard from non-Spanish speaking folk that the effort that it took to read it paid off in the end because they felt that they had experienced something on a much deeper level than if it had been translated for them.
Okay, yes, thank you so much. Absolutely. Sherry, yeah, authenticity.
Yeah, so authenticity is a concern of mine. I have to say, though, it wasn't as much a concern when I was writing this story as it was when it became when it was time for publication. So in writing this story, I wrote this story as it came to me. I didn't particularly think of who was going to read it. I just wanted to be true to what I received. And it happened to be a story that was set on a beach in Barbados, with characters who speak in a particular way. And that story was just full of Bajan expressions, aspects of our culture, things we understand, and things about the way that we live. Now, when it came time for publication, I think I was lucky in that I had editors who understood my position on what was in the book, and were also very sensitive to some concerns I had. So, I did get a couple editorial notes asking me about, for example, what did I mean when I said that one character was barring the other one on a bicycle? Does that mean transporting somebody on the bicycle bar? Yes, but the way that we would say it is, this person is barring the other person on the bicycle. That's how, it would have been expressed. certainly in the time that I was thinking of when I wrote the story. And therefore, it was important for me to maintain that in the published version. And I think I was lucky in that I had editors who were, like I said, understanding and willing to go with that. But, had that not been the case, then I really do think there would have been, a serious kind of point of departure, because it was just really important to me. I think doing anything other than writing authentically does a disservice, to you as a writer, but also to the story and even to the readers. I think we have a duty to share this story as it comes and as it should be shared. Yes, it should be as polished and as fully realized as we can make it based on our skills, but it has to be the real story. It can't be a story that changes parts of itself to make it more palatable or more easily understood. I keep talking about, growing up, and yes, being a voracious reader, and reading Enid Blyton books, just as quickly as I could get my hands on them. And there would always be this particular food called blancmange. For every birthday party or celebration, these youngsters would have this thing that I had never tasted, had no idea what it really looked like. At the time that I was reading those stories, Google, was in the future. So there was no way for me other than, trying to go for a dictionary or something. And it just didn't give this sense. I couldn't see it. I couldn't smell it. I didn't have that understanding. But I knew that it was food and it was considered a treat. And for the purposes of this story, that's all I needed to know. And that's the same level of respect, I think, that I hope readers bring to my work. So if I'm writing a story and relaying that story in an authentic way means that I'm putting some, bits of reality from me, or things that are common in my part of the world that maybe somebody else reading from somewhere else doesn't understand as easily. I hope they pay the work, the respect of just trying to understand what it is from the context and kind of going along with it for the ride. But I think, I'm loyal to the story first and foremost, and everything else is icing. Yeah.
And speaking of icing, so Dalma mentioned that she doesn't use a glossary, and you mentioned before yesterday that a glossary to you is an apology.
It is, yes, definitely. And I had that experience. That's a personal story for me. When I was pursuing my MA in writing in the UK at the time, and I was part of this workshop, and we had to kind of come to the workshop and bring an example of writing that we admired. And then we also had to bring, a piece of work that we had written for presentation to the class for critique. And I brought this story by a Caribbean writer, and I read that. And then I read my own story, and it was about this guy who is just, a bit of an eccentric character who he's sort of a wanderer, but he comes into the village, and although he has quite a shady past, he really manages to transform this village in the lead up to Kadooment, which is what we call, I guess what people would understand as carnival. And, I read this story, and one of the students in the class actually said to me, I couldn't make head or tail of half of that. You really should at least put in a glossary for people like me so we can understand it. And I was so taken aback. It really is something that I consider one of those defining moments in my writing career that really contributed to who I am as a writer today. And I said in no uncertain terms that I would not include a glossary, because a glossary, central to the idea of having to translate what was there is this notion that what is there is not the right thing or the real thing or the central thing. Whatever I write, when I write, I don't write from a margin. I say that as far as I'm concerned, when I'm writing, I am writing from the center of who I am, where I come from, my worldview, and my perspective. And, anybody is welcome to share that, any reader, but I'm certainly not going to approach it from the perspective of, this is something sort of on the fringes of what is correct or what is central to our understanding of language and literature. And therefore, in order for people to understand it, let me kind of translate some elements of it so it's more palatable. I think that does a great disservice to me as a writer and to my work. Not to mention, where I'm from. So I think that suggestion was an opportunity for me to kind of crystallize that in my own head. And I really, I am absolutely opposed to a glossary in that context.
I'm sorry that happened to you, but grateful that you are just like, no, I'm not writing nobody's glossary.
Mhm.
No, not at all.
Yeah.
And actually something you said made me think, Dalma, you were mentioning, you were talking about language sharing, and that, translating things, but Dalma, you said before that sometimes things can't be translated, right? And so do you want to elaborate on that?
Well, there are concepts that can't really be translated. I wanted, for instance, one of my characters to speak in idiomatic expressions or sayings or proverbs, but you just can't translate those. It makes no sense. For instance, there's a saying that goes, "You have such good eggs and I have no frying pan." Well, that doesn't make any sense in English, but what it means, it's supposedly a sentiment of admiration for a young lady that is very attractive, and this man does not feel like he can live up to her, right? But by the time I explain all of that, the continuity is gone. Yeah. So what's happened is with my second book, I don't have to worry about it because there's a Spanish version. And so in the Spanish version, they can do that. And in the English version, I can either come up with an English equivalent or just let it go and move into figurative language or something like that. So that's one thing. And then with certain characters, when I try to give them the voice of the vernacular, sometimes they ended up sounding more West Indian than Puerto Rican because that was the sound that was around me at the time. Okay. So it's been a challenge.
A challenge. Fair enough.
A challenge.
Well, thank y'all for indulging me on this question of authenticity. We do have a question that I've received in my DMs from an audience member, Sandra Schmid. And this is a question for Dalma. It says, what is an example, a few lines from the stories your relatives told on the porch when you were a kid?
Oh, okay. Now, most of these ladies were much older than I at the time. And they were telling me about a hurricane that struck the island I think it was like 1928, San Cipriano. And my grandmother was talking about how there was so much destruction, but the hardest thing was that so many of their neighbors were swept away, were disappeared. And my grandfather, as one of the men who survived, went out every day in search of the cadavers of their neighbors. And of course, trees were swept away as well. So there were not many coffins or so people had to have mass graves or in one case I heard about, they only had a small coffin and the person was very large. So they had to break his legs to get him into the coffin. So all of those stories just stayed with me because they're so foreign to our reality today. So when Katrina hit and when some other disasters hit, I wondered how people survived it, and the people who did survive it, how their psychological life was affected by it. And this is still happening today with people who survived Hurricane Maria in Puerto Rico several years ago. There may be a lot of help in terms of reconstructing structures or dealing with health situations. But there are many people who are still suffering from PTSD who may never get over it. So it's something that stayed with me then, and every time there's a natural disaster, it comes back to me. So that was a total downer. Sorry about that. But
no, not at all. I think it's good to sit and reflect on moments like that because I think that's you do that in your novel. Like you talk about this hurricane that literally sweeps people away. And it's easy in a book. We can just kind of be like, oh, that's sad and close it. But when we're sitting here, we have to really grapple with it and think about it. And the legacy that leaves in terms of PTSD, generational memory, it's hard. So no,
yes.
it's not a downer. It's a reality check.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. And one of the reasons why I love fiction, I sometimes read nonfiction and journalism, but one of the reasons that I love fiction is because when somebody tells you 4,000 people died, okay, 4,000 people died. What does that mean in reality? Does that mean that as many people died as could fill a baseball field? Or how does our brain wrap itself around these catastrophic situations? And maybe some people feel we shouldn't have to because it's a protectiveness, right? It's I don't have to go there. But other people feel like it's a reality and get used to it because it's not going away. Mm-hmm. So, but while writing a chapter for my second novel, I had to go there. I mean, we have to go there as writers if we're going to bring our readers along with us. And I thought I did a great job, closed the computer, started throwing up and did not stop and had to go to the hospital because I felt that reality so closely. So I think I since then I've learned how to distance myself, maybe not write a scene for 4 hours, but yeah, it's a great question.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, thank you so much for your question, mm-hmm. Sandra. Appreciate it. And so Sherry, I have one that's related to that. So is the one-armed sister, the story of the one-armed sister, is that a story that you heard as a child growing up?
No, the story of the one-armed sister is actually, it's a tale that was made up for the novel. Okay. But I say that with the knowledge that telling children stories of terrible monsters who will get them if they do things that are not sanctioned or not correct based on community wisdom is definitely a part of our tradition in the Caribbean. I mean, everybody, you know, has experienced that, being a young girl and being told, you know, don't go outside walking after dark, the grease man will get you, or the baku, or something, some horrible monstrous creature or thing, some terrible fate that will befall you if you don't do what you're being told to do. So it wasn't hard to come up with that as a result, because I'm sure we've all heard those stories. I certainly have.
No, I wasn't sure because my friend, I was telling them about the book and I was telling about the one-armed sister, and they're like, is this a real story? I was like, I mean, I kept looking for it and I was like, I don't know.
No.
But I was like, I was like, look, it's like, I was like, you know, the stories we were told, don't do this.
Yeah.
I just got done teaching Nalo Hopkinson's Greedy Choke Puppy today. And so my students were like, oh my gosh, the Sukuyan and oh La Diablesse. And I was like, no, these are stories designed to warn men and children about what they should and shouldn't do. And so they were super fascinated. So I mean, so I understand that it's not hard to make up, but I was like, is this real? Like, oh my goodness. So we had a good time. I was like, I'm going to ask the question for sure.
Right.
That means she did a great job.
She did, because I was reading the story. They were like, is this real? I was like, I mean, it's real in the book. I don't know, but I said, I can't find it on Google. That doesn't mean anything. So.
Right.
Oh yeah, no, definitely. Oh goodness. Well, I'm thinking still about craft. I want to go back to Dalma's comment and ask you a question, Sherry, because we if you haven't read How the One-Armed Sister Sweeps Her House, it's a lot, right? I was like, ooh, it is a lot. Traumatic in a number of ways. But one of the things that I found, I was listening to it on audiobook, and as I was reading it, I noticed that there are 3 chapters where you use the second person. And for me, especially the first time, it was the second person. And so second person, like you, second person perspective point of view. And it's all Lala. And the first time is essentially where her husband is raping her and post childbirth, but not 6 weeks and still sore. You know, the rest of the novel is essentially third person point of view from different people's perspectives. And can you talk about why you chose the second person you for those particular instances with Lala in chapters 3, 13, and 25?
Sure. Okay, so the use of the second person was deliberate, and I did that for a number of reasons. The first thing is that women in Lala's set of circumstances, in terms of the abuse that she suffered, tend to go through after a prolonged period and you know, at different points in time, something that's like a dissociative state. So it is as if there is that fracturing of self and identity. So it's almost as if this person is looking at themselves from outside of the body. And that is a common response to severe trauma. And therefore, writing in the second person tries to capture that within the text, because it is clear that it's being written from Lala's perspective, but she no longer inhabits the I. There is no first person, there's no ability to render in the first person because of that trauma and that fracturing. So that's the first reason. The second reason why it's used, it is because, you know, in the examples that I've observed, it can also be a way of allowing the reader to really enter the world of the text. And at a particular point in time where something is happening that's really important, and it's really important for the reader to get it, the use of you, it's almost as if the text is speaking directly to this reader. It's less of that distance. It's less of that awareness that this is just a story. We come out of that safe space of this story, and the reader is being forced to experience what is happening, almost as if they were the protagonist or the character that it relates to at that point in time. So those are two reasons that, you, the second person, would have been used at those points in the story.
Well, if you were trying to be successful, you succeeded. And because when Dama was talking about, I vomited after reading or after writing that for several hours, I didn't vomit necessarily after listening to and reading that second portion, but it was different. I was telling my friends about the first couple of chapters, but then when I got to chapter 3 and it was the you, I was like, oh, that's me. Right. There was this sort of distance from Lala and, bleeding out, going to the hospital and going through these thoughts. But as soon as she hit that you, I was like, oh, shoot. And I love that it's paced throughout. I don't know how I would have been able to get through a novel had it all been in the second person you. And so I do like I understand the disassociation of body, but it was really powerful. And so personally speaking, you succeeded in, jolting me out of that sort of distance and living in and through Lala. So thank you.
You're welcome. I'm so glad to hear that.
Yeah, it's a lovely work, y'all. So I am looking at time and we have about 15 more minutes on the clock. And so if there are other questions, feel free to either raise your virtual hand or ask. But I have other questions, or if you two have questions for each other, I could keep going.
No, I will let you go. Go with it.
Well, I am curious. So there were just some writers. So just for y'all in the audience, we did briefly meet up yesterday just to work out any technical issues. And so I believe, Dama, you mentioned that, you really enjoy Toni Morrison, and Sherry, I think in Scott Momaday was a writer you mentioned, but could you talk about what literary pilgrimages you've gone on, or if you'd like, what literary ancestors or contemporary ones like influence your writing or things like that? Because I am curious.
Yeah, I can talk about that. There are so many Caribbean writers whose shoulders I stand on, and my work is very strongly influenced by these writers, and almost at some points in conversation with what has gone before me. I can think straight off Earl Lovelace, V.S. Naipaul, Olive Sr., Jamaica Kincaid, Toni Morrison, Amy Bender, Leanne Shapton. There's some contemporary Caribbean writers whose work I very much admire. Shakira Bourne, Linda Dean, Esther Phillips, Sharma Taylor. These are people who are, friends and colleagues who are sources of support and guidance and wisdom about writing and the path of writing, of being a writer. So yeah, my influences there are really so many writers whose work has inspired me and helped me in creating my own voice.
Very nice. Thank you. I can write quick when I need to. So I have a list just that fast.
Gosh, there's so many more that I could, as every time I do this, I think, oh, you should have mentioned Timothy Calendar. Oh, you didn't mention this, buddy. You know, it's that kind of thing, but they are really so many people.
Absolutely. Thank you for sharing. Dalma?
I also have so many that it's hard to just not rattle off forever, but I love the what has come to be known as the magic realism tradition from Latin America. I think that all oppressed people find alternative ways of dealing with oppression. And I think that what's called magic realism, which to me, it could be magic realism, it could be African mysticism, it could be religion, it could be spirituality. So what is one man's magic realism is another man's Yoruba tradition, right? So so that's really important to me because that's a part of our culture that is not spoken about. And I think one of the reasons I love Toni Morrison is because she goes there. She talks about things that people don't want to talk about. It reminds me of when I read to, well, let me make it specific. I read to a high school class once, and I read a section that had to do with African religion. And then I asked everybody, well, what's your religion? And everybody said Catholic. And I said, okay, how many of you have a grandmother that has an altar in a room that other people are not invited into? And that she, and all of a sudden everybody started giggling, right? And so, yeah, Catholic cum is something else. So I think that's one of the things that I really like tapping into, is looking at the underpinnings of our culture that are not generally shared. And so you will always find in my novels African religion. You will always find one of the orishas as a character in that. And so that's one aspect of it. So I love Nalo Hopkinson, for instance, from Canada. I love Yolanda Arroyo Pizarro, who is an Afro-Puerto Rican short story writer and poet. And Alice Walker, I think The Color Purple was seminal in looking at epistolary literature and how much you can do with letter writing and voice. Isabel Allende and Garcia Marquez, of course, from that tradition. So these people have given me permission to speak out loud what has not been spoken. And so I try to tell the story not told as much as I can.
Well, Ashe, which you've gotten in the comments. And also there's a message, Sandra says that magical realism is a great word to replace fiction.
Okay.
Yeah. So I'd love if Sandra said a little more about that, but but I like both of your literary ancestry, because essentially you both have said that these writers are giving me permission. They gave me permission, or I'm indebted to them. And I think that's really important, just acknowledging how far we've come and who our ancestors, literary ancestors, happen to be. Nydia Okorafor says something similar to Octavia about Octavia Butler and giving her permission to write the things that she didn't see in terms of African futurism or African Jujuism. And so I love the lists as well. So we have about 10 minutes. So Dalma, are you interested in sharing anything from Woman of Endurance?
Sure, I will share. First of all, oh, I don't think I can share it. The cover, no, the background. Anyway, food and community are really important in this novel. And I want to read just a little bit. Now I know I set it aside. Let me put my reading glasses on and stop fronting because I can't see.
It's okay, and I will put a link in the chat to the book so you can see the cover.
Okay. Okay, so this section is, I'll give you a little explanation. Paula is an enslaved woman who has had a very brutal experience in the first plantation, and her owner has gambled her away to a second plantation. And this is her trying to learn this new world that she has been brought into. Okay. And this is the first time that she is well enough. She's been recovering from injuries. And this is the first time that she is well enough to join the rest of the community. Paula's attention is focused on a group of Negros called to the meal. As she expected, there are the brawny men and the strongly built women of the field, but she is astounded by the children among them, toddlers, infants in women's arms, as well as almost grown youth. Paula has never seen these many Black children since she was taken from her village. A woman sits a bit apart from the rest and pulls out a swollen breast. Her baby immediately latches on, and they rock back and forth as one unit. Can this be a place where women are not robbed of their wombs? Where Black mothers are allowed to nurse, to guide, to feed, play with their own babies? Where they can watch them grow into men and women and maybe even marry and have babies of their own? Paula's vision blurs as she remembers a tiny hand resting on her breast, a hungry mouth closing on her nipple, and the ache of an empty space where her baby had once rested. The pain and the longing for her lost children spring up when she least expects them. She bites on her lip to keep the feelings inside and shakes her head clear of the memory, forcing herself to focus on the scene before her. At the call, the people take their places around the circle to begin the meal. Simon sits among the men at the opposite side of the circle, his eyes trained on her. While she refuses to acknowledge Simon's gaze, Paula examines everything and everyone else. The adults sit around the big circle chatting and calling to one another. Still amazing to Paula, children run and play nearby. Some of the older girls sit at a respectful distance from the adult conversation and whisper to each other as the older boys pretend not to notice. These people might be exhausted and ravenous, sitting with empty ditas in hand, waiting for their meal. but they aren't enclenque. No bones poking through, no distended bellies, no fixed glazes, no missing limbs, no fear permanently etched into their faces. There are no whips, no chains, and no overseers hovering, at least not visible from here, but new eyes can be deceived. As she surveys the area, she is drawn to movement on the other side of the circle. The boys hold her attention. They seem familiar, but how can they be? As though sensing her scrutiny, they stop and look directly at Paula, almost as though they expected her. They smile broadly and wave before continuing their play. Who are these children? They seem so very comfortable with her presence, but before she can place them, Rufina comes back and hands Paula a dita with a generous portion of a fragrant stew. Eat, drink. El agua de coco helps with the healing, and the stew will make you strong again. The boys are forgotten as Paula's eyes latch onto the offering. Her mouth waters as she sniffs at her helping of gandinga, a dish that she's being introduced to for the first time. Later, it will become her favorite, a thick red stew made of organ meats carefully set aside from the choice cuts of pork that grace the patrona's meal. Served over plain white rice, it seems like a chief's feast to Paula. Since she arrived, she had been fed small portions of simple food. Now, Paula takes pleasure in the plentiful portion placed before her. She scoops the food and the flavors explode in her mouth. She has never tasted the complex blend of culantro, oregano, lauceas, ajo, spices that make the family's unwanted cuts of meat a sumptuous meal. She loses herself in the taste and smell of the food, gathering up contents of the bowl with hooked fingers, sucking every morsel, rolling it around her mouth, chewing carefully and making it last. She licks the inside of her bowl until it is smooth and clean. Finally, she puts her mouth to the opening at the top of the coconut and tilts her head back to catch the sweet liquid. When she's done, she sits in awe. She had almost forgotten the taste of good food, lovingly prepared. This meal takes her back to her village. The memory brings tears to her eyes. And then we switch the point of view, and we're looking from Simon, who is across the circle from her, right? The woman eats as though it were her first and last meal. She loses herself with the abandon of a child. The liquid drips and stains her clothes, and she is too intent to care who watches her devour the food, tearing into meats with ferocity, swallowing the vegetable chunks whole. She stuffs the rice and licks every finger. There is no embarrassment in her taking obvious pleasure in the act of eating. What path has brought her here? What horrors and hardships has she survived? How many other pleasures has she been denied? I will watch you, Paula. I will watch you and take in the measure of your life, and then we shall see.
Okay. I'm sorry. That's probably not very professional. But...
Well, one thing I must say about Simon in this book, he was not a planned character. He showed up in my meditation and said, I am going to tell my story,
Okay.
and you will stay out of it.
Okay.
I am going to tell it in first person, and I am going to speak directly to the reader. You just take care of the other chapters. I will do mine. And that's exactly what happens.
Okay. Well, if I didn't want to read the book before, which I did, I certainly want to read it now. So, oh, that was perfect. That was.
Since we're talking about food, I thought I'd throw that in there.
Oh, yeah, no. but I mean, between being hungry, wanting to dance, and now read this book that doesn't come out for a few more months, I've got plenty to think about.
And then an implied different kind of hunger, but we won't even go there.
Yes, absolutely. And so to wrap up, since we know that you do have a forthcoming work soon, Sherry, I know this is probably not the question you want to know, since it hasn't even been a year since your first novel was published, but are you thinking about another novel?
Yes, I am. I'm actually working on a novel right now. It's set on a cocoa plantation in Trinidad in the middle of the 19th century. And it's written from the point of view, the perspective of an 8-year-old girl called Nib. So that's what I'm working on at the moment, as well as a collection of flash fiction.
Okay.
Yes.
Oh,
All right. I
I want to read that. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, this is so good. I'm so excited. So I want to thank everybody for showing up tonight. It is 6:32, so I do want to respect the time. And so I would like to thank you for joining us for the 4th installment of Words Across the Water. Thank you so much to our writers for being so gracious with their time. Sherry Jones, Dalma Llanos Figueroa, thank you both so much. And their websites are in the chat, so feel free to check them out. And they are on social media as well. Tom, I turn it back over to you. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you, Kendra. Thank you, Sherry. Thank you, Dalma. Wonderful evening. I can't write as quickly as you can give me literary tips, but my reading list is full. I thank the people who made this possible, but I forgot to thank some of the most important people who made it possible, and that's you, the audience. Thank you for coming out. Thank you for coming out again. Thank you for coming out tonight. I see my wife is with us tonight, and so I quite honestly, I have to say that I met Allison when she was one of my wife's students, and without that connection, we probably wouldn't be here tonight. So I guess I probably should have begun that by thanking Mary Cassidy, but I want to thank everybody for showing up. And as a way of thanking you, tomorrow you'll get an email, tomorrow or the next day, as soon as we can pull it together, asking you to evaluate this program. That is an essential thing that, because we're doing this on public money, we have to ask you to evaluate it. As a way of thank you for coming out, I'm going to pick 2 random people. I don't know who they are, but 2 of the people who are here tonight, and through Amazon, have them send you a copy of one of our 2 readers' books. It'll be random. I will ask, probably, this account is in the name of Allison McCletchie, so after tonight I won't be able to get into it. So I'll have to ask Dr. McCletchie to randomly pick two emails, and 2 of you will hear from me. All of you will hear from her or me soon, asking you to do a brief survey. So thank you again. I do invite you to stay around. Oh, one more link I wanted to put up there. I thanked, if I can find it. I thanked Lauren Elaine from the Furious Flower Institute, who has been a crucial advisor. So let me put this link out there. She is doing, Furious Flower is doing a reading tomorrow on Facebook. So please feel encouraged to check that out. I've attended several of their readings when I can, and again, I come away from them filled with admiration and inspiration. I invite you all to stay around a few minutes after we've stopped recording. I'll keep the line open for a few minutes anyway, until people want to talk. And with that, I'm going to stop recording and wish everybody a great evening and a happy autumn.